Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Tuesday Tales of Terror. I'm your host, Kali Mortwood, and I just want to thank you for being here tonight. If you were here from the beginning, I do want to apologize for the long hiatus. It was just meant to be a short break, and it turned into quite some time. So I just want to say thank you for being here, for sticking it out with me, for being patient with my process. And I told myself, Kali, if you don't do anything else in this life, at the very bare minimum, the least thing that you can do is to finish that book, because we left it off pretty much right in the middle, and that would just be disastrous. So we are going to continue reading The Man Who Was Poe, by Avi, A-V-I, and we read up to chapter 12, the end of chapter 12. Now, if it has been a long time for you, like it has been for me, then I know I needed to read it again and get a little summary. So I did us the favor of writing it down, a little summary of some of the characters, what's going on, so we kind of have a gist. It's pretty simple and straightforward. If you are here for the first time and you didn't have an incredibly long break with me, good for you. A summary might be helpful anyway, just for all of us to be on the same page. Here we are. The Man Who Was Poe. Now, it is a very chilly November 1848 in Providence, Rhode Island. And we have a main character. He's an 11-year-old boy. His name is Edmund. He's from England, and he has lost all of his family. We find out in the very beginning that his sister, twin sister, Sis, has gone missing. They've lived here for a month with their aunt, who is now also missing. She brought them over with her from England to find her sister, their mother, who, you've guessed it, is missing. So the aunt had them living in this very small apartment, basically a bedroom and a sink. Not even a bedroom, just like a one room with a bed and a sink. And she's gone missing, Auntie Prue. And now when Edmund finally left the apartment because they were starving, he ran to go get bread. And on the way back, he got distracted by this old man who asked him for directions. Now, he had locked Sis in the apartment, but when he got back to the apartment and unlocked the door, Sis was completely missing. No sign or trace of her, no sign of struggle, nothing. She's just gone. And you cannot unlock the door from the inside. Or no, you can, but she wouldn't have, he swears, because it was locked. How else would she lock it? He had the only key. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. So then we run into Mr. Dupin, who is an alias for Edgar Allan Poe, and he's a bit of an alcoholic, which we all know to be true. And he begs him for help. He says, "No one else can help me. My sister is missing." So then Mr. Dupin agrees to help him in exchange for a place to sleep. And so as they're walking back to the apartment, they come across a young woman. Two men are standing around this young woman who's dead on the docks. They just found her floating in the water. And when he sees her, he sees that she has a striking resemblance to Edmund. And so he pulls Edmund over, and Edmund confirms that it is his Auntie Prue, who was found dead. Now, the two men who found Auntie Prue are Asa Throck, Mr. Throck. He's a tall, big, balding man with a scar face. He works the night watch. And Fortnoy, who is an older, stooped, ferret-faced gentleman with white hair. So when Mr. Dupin decided to help Edmund, the next morning they woke up to a note underneath the door that said, "Meddle at your peril." Okay? So Mr. Dupin is inspecting the room, and he sees that there's a window directly across of a mirrored apartment complex. So this apartment complex is exactly the same. It's just a mirrored image, basically. And the window is pretty close. So he goes down, goes to the next apartment building, and he says, "Hey, who's renting this room?" And she says, "Well, there was a man who rented it for about 2 weeks, but he hasn't paid his rent." So that's interesting. He says, may I check it out? She says, yeah, go ahead. He never moved anything in. He goes there. It's an empty room except for a board, and the board is just long enough to get across the window. And he finds Sis's button. And so he says to Edmund, Sis crawled through the window. And Edmund's like, why would she do that? Because she got lured out by something, right? So it turns out that at the same time, all of this is going on, Providence Bank is a bank that gets robbed. And it's a very interesting robbery because there is no sign of breaking into the bank, and all of the gold has been taken out. The locks were never unlocked. And that's very interesting. So then Mr. Dupin wants to get Edmund a coat. He kind of wants to get him out of his hair for a little while so he can drink or do whatever. And so he sends Edmund to go get a coat for himself because he doesn't have any warm clothes. And when he gets there to the fitting room, there's an older, portly gentleman who is getting a suit completely fitted. And he sees the Edmund and he has a like shocked, oh, kind of response. And the tailor chases Edmund off, thinking that it just scared him because it was a beggar boy. We find out later that that man took off that suit and ran out without paying for it, which is very interesting. Blah, 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 blah. Edmund goes back to the room and he finds it completely tossed. The door was unlocked, the room is tossed, and the only thing that's missing is the portrait of his aunt and his mom, which is obviously the only picture he has of them. Mr. Dupin goes to check out the bank where he meets Peterson. He's a young bank worker. And he talks about Mr. Ratchet. Mr. Ratchet, turns out, works at the bank. And he was the older man who was getting his suit fitted. Okay? Then we find out by talking to Edmund that Mr. Ratchet is actually Edmund's stepfather, although he's never met the man. Now, his dad died out at sea, and so his mother remarried, and she married Mr. Ratchet, who gypped her and took all of her money and ran off with it. So that's why she came to Providence in the first place, was to find Mr. Ratchet and get her money back if she could and get a divorce. And that's when she went missing, and she's been missing for a year. So through his powers of deduction, Mr. Dupin figures out that they must have lowered someone through the ventilation shaft in the top of the bank vault. And it couldn't have been an adult because it's a very small ventilation shaft. And he also found a piece of rope and another of Sis's buttons, I believe. Yes. While doing all of this, trying to solve this murder, Mr. Dupin is also trying to court a woman, Mrs. Whitman. Now, he has sent her letters by means of Edmund sending them to the front door. The first one was intercepted, and he finally gets message from her to meet her in the cemetery, which I think is very romantic, by the way. While he's in the cemetery on his own, waiting for her to come meet him in secret, he sees the ghost of who he believes is the children's Auntie Prue, because it looks very similar to her. And she yells at him, "What have you done with my children?" At the moment that he's backing up, he gets a big hand on his shoulder, and it turns out that is Throck. And Throck says, "Hey, you've been hanging out with that boy a lot. Why are you meddling?" And he corners him in the tombstone. And who knows what he would do if Mrs. Whitman hadn't showed up. So Mrs. Whitman shows up and saves him. And Mr. Throck ambles off. And then Mrs. Whitman says, "I am very interested in you, but I think that you've been drinking, and my mother doesn't like you, which you already know because she intercepted a letter from you. And we're going into a dinner, and there's enemies everywhere." So that's what she tells him before they go into their dinner. And that's where we leave off. Oh, and the last thing is, Edmund is on his way to inspect the Lady Liberty, which is a boat that Mr. Fourtnoy said that he works on when he found Auntie Prue's body. And Mr. Dupin has already admitted that he believes that Fourtnoy, the older gentleman, had something to do with the murder of Auntie Prue. That has completely caught us up. I hope that you were able to catch up with that. If I talk too fast, watch it again. Just kidding. You can also adjust the speed down below. So here we begin. Chapter 13, Our Secret Fears. This is Mrs. Whitman speaking. Will you be all right? Mrs. Whitman asked the moment they were inside. Dupin pressed trembling hands over his face, then withdrew them. Helen, I love as I've never loved. I beg you, she whispered urgently. Not now. I will be missed. Follow me. Dupin held her back. You said they were enemies. I'm not sure I can. You don't know how weak I am. You must. They are testing us, and we are expected. She reached up and gently touched his face. Come, she said softly. If you believe in me and us. Sweating, almost overwhelmed by tension, Dupin followed her into the parlor. 5 people were there, all dressed in black. How very stylish. All had teacups in their hands. All were talking genially. But when Dupin entered, conversation ceased. May I present, Mrs. Whitman announced, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. Dupin made a slight bow, but as he did, a shock went through him. Every one of the women he saw had the face of the apparition in the tomb. Apparition. Every man resembled Edmund. Yet even as he gazed at them, they shifted and blurred into a single death's head. Then one by one they changed again, each becoming some distinct special figure. Oh, sounds very eerie. Dupin knew then where he had come. He had descended into a gathering of demons, a mask of black death. Mr. Poe, Dupin heard Mrs. Whitman say as if at a great distance. Here is my mother, Mrs. Powers. She indicated an elderly woman who from her chair acknowledged Dupin with a curt nod. Dupin saw only her arm, the same ghost-like arm he had seen taking his letter at the door the night before. This is Dr. Dillard, Mrs. Whitman continued, turning toward a plump man with very pink cheeks. He wore a clerical collar. His orations at funerals are famous here in Providence. Dupin noted only a hideous, satanic grin. And Mrs. Dillard, Mrs. Whitman went on, referring to a tiny woman who sat by the minister's side. She offered a nervous smile in Dupin's direction. In her, Dupin saw death's consort. And here is Mr. Arnold, Mrs. Whitman said. When Dupin looked at the whiskered man, he saw nothing but a figure gross with greed and lust. A great pleasure to meet the celebrated Mr. Poe, Arnold intoned boldly. Mr. Poe of the Raven and the Gold Bug. I am, sir, your literary admirer. You have informed me much about the darker passions. Dupin managed a stiff smile. Thank you, sir, he said. And finally, Mrs. Whitman concluded, Mr. MacFarlane. Mr. MacFarlane is one of our own Providence poets. But not so fortunate in glory or genius as the famous Mr. Poe, said Mr. MacFarlane, a bald, cheerful-looking man. Dupin took him for a devil. Introductions over, Dupin felt them all staring at him with venomous eyes. Catherine, Mrs. Whitman called anxiously, some tea for Mr. Poe? Arnold approached Dupin, offered his hand, and said, I have long wanted to meet you, sir. Dupin turned, wondering what torture this monstrous creature had prepared for him. I've read much of your work, Arnold continued, his voice growing loud as he warmed to his inquiry, and I've always wondered how you came up with your ideas. That is to say, Mr. Poe, your tales have the most fantastical notions. All these stories of crime, brutality, death. Arnold shifted about to catch Mrs. Power's eye. Do these things, he said, turning back to Dupin, come from within you, sir? Why so much concern with evil? Dupin was reminded of the fright he'd just experienced in the cemetery and wondered what this beast might have to do with it. Or perhaps, Arnold pressed when Dupin did not answer, the question upsets you. No, Dupin forced himself to say, not so. Well, please, Arnold urged. I wish you would explain. Trying to steady himself, Dupin passed a hand over his face. Suddenly he understood who these monsters were. They were his own creations, his own torments, his own pain. Confront them, he said to himself. Tell them what they are, and they will go. Evil, he began, but faltered. Evil is only the name we give our secret fears. Ooh, wow. Oh, I like that. Evil is only the name we give our secret fears. I'm going to write that down. Fears? Dr. Dillard demanded from across the room. Of what? The fears in our hearts, Dupin continued, trying to untangle his thoughts and speaking barely above a whisper. Ah, Arnold cried, as in your telltale heart and the gold bug. The telltale heart. I must protest, Dr. Dillard declared. I, for one, have no such fears within me. Quite right, Dr. Dillard, Mr. McFarlane was quick to add. Nor do I. As for the ladies, certainly they have no such fears. He made a bow toward Mrs. Whitman. Could you give us more of an explanation? Dr. Dillard asked. Dupin pressed his hands together tightly, tried to smile, but failed. What I believe, he said finally, his voice strained, is that writers write about what they know best. And, he concluded, what some writers know best is what they fear. Could you, Mr. McFarlane said, give us an example? There was a trace of mockery in his voice. Dupin, aware that he was being put to a crucial test, felt a renewed onslaught of nervousness. His eyes swept around his tormentors. Anything? Arnold insisted from across the room. Dupin found himself floundering again. With a look, he appealed to Mrs. Whitman. Perhaps, she prompted, from ordinary life. It was the help Dupin needed. He remembered something. Yes, he announced. I can give you an example. A puzzle. He studied the grotesque faces before him. A puzzle which, if we could fully understand it, would bring the truth. Do say, urged Mrs. Powers. If a man, Dupin began, if a man orders a coat, a fine coat, has it made and fitted, and yet, at the last moment, chooses not to take it, might not the reason why he decides thus yield some important facts so that what appears to be irrational becomes rational? And what has this to do with fear? Mrs. Powers exclaimed. Why, Mr. Arnold, where are you going? Dupin, startled, swung about. Mr. Arnold, red-faced and flustered, was standing by the door. My apologies, I must go, he announced. But, Mr. Arnold, Mrs. Powers called. Urgent business, he murmured, and bowed himself out. Dupin stared after him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He decided he had smitten one of his enemies. He felt his tension ease. While the other guests chatted quietly amongst themselves, Dupin carefully sipped his tea and tried to calm his nerves. The creatures in the room were beginning to look more like people. To his left sat Mrs. Whitman. Mr. McFarlane was on his right. I should think, Mrs. Whitman said to Mr. McFarlane, that Mr. Poe's poem, The Raven, is the most profound poetic expression America has ever produced. Oh, yes, McFarlane agreed. We can all readily agree to that. But it just seemed so, what shall I say, Mr. Poe, So different from your tales, sir. How are my tales different? I must admit, McFarlane said, they make me very uncomfortable, almost unclean. There's something of the sublime in Nevermore. But then we have the murders in the Rue Morgue, with the character you invented, this Auguste Dupin. I must say he's a most improbable personage. What are your objections? Dupin asked. Why, sir, to speak with honesty, no man could reason as your Dupin does. Besides, I felt the story to be a low, bestial, sordid thing. It appalled me. And, sir, I mean you no offense, but I see none of that sordidness in your face. Mrs. Whitman attempted to laugh lightly. Come now, Mr. McFarlane, she said. Can you read so much from a face? McFarlane smiled. I, for one, believe in the reading of faces, don't you, Mr. Poe? Dupin, no longer feeling himself under attack, turned to Mrs. Whitman and gazed calmly at her. He even smiled, then looked about the room. There were now only people. He had won. Every fear, every image, he said as much to himself as to the others, has two sides. Oh, I quite agree, McFarlane interjected. Good things seem to be readily apparent, but the bad. Again Dupin addressed Mrs. Whitman. What can you read from my face? He asked. Mrs. Whitman blushed. I should need more time, she managed to say. As much as you need, Dupin responded gallantly. Did you know, she informed him with a nervous laugh, an establishment for the making of daguerreotypes has opened in the city. Now, I had to look that word up because I had no idea what it means. And a daguerreotype is a photograph taken at this time by an iodine sensitized silvered plate and mercury vapor. So an early type of photograph, daguerreotype. Did you know, she informed him with a nervous laugh, an establishment for the making of daguerreotypes has opened in the city. Oh, yes, McFarlane interjected. In the arcade. I've heard they make many fine images. Now, Mr. Poe, Mrs. Whitman went on, if you were to have a portrait made, and I had it in my possession, I might be able to study your character at my leisure. Mrs. Whitman. Where are you staying, Mr. Poe? Mrs. Powers suddenly interjected. With some friends, he replied. With anyone we might know? I don't believe so. And how long shall you be staying? Well, that depends. On what? On Mrs. Whitman. Mrs. Whitman blushed again. Dupin set aside his teacup and stood. I am going directly to that daguerreotype studio, he announced. I shall see what kind of an image they can produce, and I shall offer it to you, so you may study it at your leisure. But, Mr. Poe, Mrs. Powers snapped, which image of yourself shall you present? I never know, Dupin returned. Well, my friends, that concludes chapter 13 of The Man Who Was Poe. And it takes us right up to the time that we need to end our episode. So we're going to stop here. We are completely caught up. So next time when we begin episode 58, we'll be able to jump right into the story. And I'm excited to see where it goes. Thank you once again for being here, for sitting with me this evening, listening to the story. I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going and that you get to knock things off your list this week because that always feels good. Yes. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. If you'd like to leave a comment, I appreciate those and I will respond to each and every one. And I'm happy to have you here. And so with that, I'll be signing off. I'm your host, Kali Mortwood, and I send you off with peace and love and blessings upon you. Mwah. Ciao for now. Stay spooky.